automated piece of shit.
It's the evil Siri, the Zoom Siri.
I asked Siri the other day, actually.
Is being recorded.
I actually asked Google the other day if she was male or female, and she said she has no gender. Then I asked if she loved me, and she said yes, which is weird. So.
Yeah, they're pretty fun to talk to.
She loves you for having bought her as a product.
I take care of her, okay? I provide her with power and electricity that I pay for. You know, I'm her daddy and her lover.
Siri's got that will to power.
Yeah.
All right, today, I mean, we're shooting the shit a little bit here, listeners, because we've done some heavy recent episodes, real deep dives into a particular theorist, and we're gonna do, I think, Heidegger next. And I've been listening back to our old some of our old episodes, and we always say we're just gonna do this philosopher. It's weird that discussing a theorist is just the active verb to do.
Yeah, it's kind of like not the deep dive approach, but the sort of broad reading approach, I guess. I don't know. Others do deeper dives on specific topics too, so that's interesting. But
well, this might also be like a male-centric perspective, but to me, a deep dive into someone sounds just as sexual as like we're going to do them, if you know what I mean. Heterosexual male perspective.
We're gonna
I'm thinking about just in general from the perspective of like media. It does seem like when people talk about like something episodic, they'll usually say, "Oh yeah, we're going to be doing that next," or you might say like we're going to cover that person also. But yeah, we do tend to use the do.
Cover sounds a lot more maternal.
Maybe, but it's true. Like I don't think I'm sure. Maybe some of us have even said that without noticing, right? Like we'll cover Heidegger next or something. I don't know.
Yeah, well, Deleuze did say that it's one big ass fuck anyway.
There you go.
So he does literally do philosophers, or he thinks he does, and then they give anal birth to some kind of new concept.
I think if anyone has a claim to doing other philosophers, it's Derrida and Deleuze.
And Foucault.
They always point out how sexual all our language is anyway, like concept and conception, childbirth and having an idea.
Eros, yeah. Oh, 100%, yeah.
Semiotics, semen, dissemination.
I mean, in some ways, there's a long history to this. If you think back to the symposium, which is basically like, hey, you know, me and the boys, we're going to get together, we're going to have some wine, we're going to talk about philosophies, and we're all going to fuck at the end of it, right?
So before anyone turns this episode off, the title is Fact News. And we've been talking about a lot of news lately between us on our multiple platforms, on our writing, our streaming. And this, I think we can start by talking about the news because there's some out there. But just in case you want to turn this off because you're tired of the news, I think most of this episode is going to be dedicated to an analysis of the term news from, of course, a theory perspective. So rather than doing a deep dive, we are doing a topical episode on what is the news if we're going to theorize about it. So let's do news, boys.
Well, I mean, there's obviously a lot going on. We did our live stream, and at that time when we did our live stream, I don't think we really like knew the outcome. So I guess, and maybe we still don't know the outcome. And it seems to be the thing that's dominating news, at least American news, that, and I guess like rises in COVID. But I mean, it seems like Joe Biden won. So I don't know if I'll just mention that to get it out of the way. Hopefully that remains true.
Well, we got some Canadian news too that Eric was ranting about in the Discord.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Eric, why don't you explain that to us?
Start with that, yeah.
Oh, well, first of all, Remembrance Day is coming up. Is it coming up?
It was yesterday.
It was yesterday, man.
Is that an American holiday also?
Or well, they have something else. They have like, is it Veterans Day there?
Veterans Day, yeah.
And they don't wear poppies the way we do.
Yeah.
Oh, so, okay, in Canada, Remembrance Day has already passed, and there's an incident with Whole Foods where Whole Foods...
Oh, that's right, yeah.
They banned their employees from wearing poppies at work, and it caused a big stink in Canadian politics.
Especially conservative politics.
Yeah, but even you heard a response from the New Democrats. There's a response from the Conservatives, and Liberals seem to keep kind of quiet about it. But basically, you have Whole Foods who banned their employees earlier from wearing any Black Lives Matter paraphernalia at work, which went virtually unnoticed. And then this time around, when they banned the poppies, the news went ballistic, and they were saying, oh, everyone should be able to wear a poppy at work, and this was on the basis of like just uniforms, right?
And for our like non-Canadian listeners, the poppy is obviously a symbol of like remembering the sacrifice that the troops have given for like World War I and World War II, and it's just a little flower that pins to like your shirt. It's like it's a tiny little red flower. Probably like 2 inches in diameter or something like that.
I bought one actually 2 days ago at the LCBO.
Yeah,
just in time.
In Flanders fields where poppies grow, something.
The crosses, row on
row. It's a World War I poem, right?
And the British also wear a poppy, although their poppy is different.
Listen to Leonard Cohen recite that poem, and it was genuinely fucking pretty chilling. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and in Canadian culture, it kind of means, when you wear a poppy, it means that you're remembering the people who sacrificed themselves for the country, but there's a little bit of contestation over the narrative of whether or not you're supporting the troops and the sort of like military apparatus, or whether it's a sort of never again type thing where we say like they died in these senseless wars for the masters of war, as the Bob Dylan song goes, and that we should be holding the ruling class accountable for these senseless wars they started. So some people have a sort of patriotic interpretation of it, and some people have a kind of like never again interpretation. But it prompted Ford to write a piece of legislation saying that businesses could not ban their employees from wearing poppies, which is great. Thanks for that, Doug Ford. Whole Foods, by the way, is owned by Jeff Bezos, the richest man in the world. And this is the only intervention into working conditions he's made, besides back in March when he wrote legislation saying that you could take a week or two off work unpaid if you felt sick. And this is the second piece of sort of worker legislation. And what really pissed me off is also the NDP response. Is like Andrea Horwath, the leader of the New Democrats, which is our sort of socialist party, is they came out. She came out and said like Ford should be allowing workers to wear whatever they like at work, kind of thing. Like, she didn't make it about free expression in the workplace, just like people should be able to choose whether or not to wear a poppy. So she missed the opportunity to make a free expression argument. She missed the opportunity to condemn Bezos and his shitty treatment that's well documented of his workers, who he's become rich off of, and even richer since the pandemic started. It's a whole clusterfuck of just stupid political shit. And I'm not
that surprised, though. I mean, like, the NDP coalition in Ontario basically consists of ultra woke intellectuals, artists, various minority groups, but then, like, and this is the key one, like blue collar workers, right? And particularly in heavy industry, who tend to be unionized. And that last group is probably going to be pretty militantly opposed to any efforts to contradict the message of the poppy as they understand it. You know what I mean?
I gotta say, I got no problem with this. Like in the sense of, like, I agree, like, Ford should do more, but like just as an isolated act, I feel like I have no problem with him doing that, because I just hate the idea that private corporations are telling their employees that what they can and can't wear. So like just even if it makes the smallest contribution to erode the power of employers to do that, I'm for it.
And Ford, if our non-American listeners remember, our crack-smoking mayor
was his brother.
Was his brother, who's dead. So now his other brother got elected by, I don't know who. I don't know.
Not just the mayor of Toronto, but the premier of Ontario.
Yeah, people thought that he was going to be like the Trump of the North, and I got to tell you, it really didn't turn out that way. Like, I don't agree with a lot of his policies, but I think he's been broadly competent, and he has even done he has like pushed some policies that I actually strongly agree with, specifically related to transit. I won't bore you with the details, but like, yeah, he has a transit plan for Toronto that I really agree with. And overall, I thought his like response to COVID has been, like, I don't know, as good as any other typical politician. Like, I don't think like it didn't seem, at least, like, at the very least, I can say that it didn't feel worse. And I also like the fact that he was working with the other premiers, working with the federal government, even though they're of different parties, and was just saying, and he even praised them. He was like, Justin Trudeau did an amazing job. Chrysler Freeland did. So like, I just liked those things, but like, do I agree with him? I mean, he's a conservative, so like, obviously, I'm not for most of the stuff.
He is a thumb in a suit.
Yeah, that's a lot of turd polishing you're doing there, and I'm not really for it at all, because he makes this intervention into the workplace not to protect workers from shitty working conditions, but to say, workers, you can wear a poppy, you're not allowed to be told not to.
I only said
and
that,
that's like, I'm gonna make an intervention into the workplace, and that's the angle I'm going.
Yeah,
with.
sure.
Fucking
I mean,
poppies once a year.
I was only saying that in the context of like people thinking he was going to be like a Trump of the North.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Like, obviously, I agree that like he's a typical, but he just turned out to be a typical conservative, a typical Canadian conservative. He did not turn out to be like some weird populist Trump at all.
But his guarantee to be able to wear these poppies, though, is he's framing it as a war on Christmas thing. Like, you have to write Christmas on your Starbucks cup.
Well, he took a page out of Trump's book recently. He just fast tracked. He just eliminated environmental assessments for building and fast track building projects. So, for instance, in near Toronto, they're trying to build a warehouse in a wetland, and the environmental protection groups were saying no, and now he's passed a bill to say, okay, you guys have no more power, we can fast track these things. So he's taking pages out of Trump's book. Like, they are flirting with Trumpism, but now that he's out of office, well,
I mean, that's a typical conservative playbook thing to cut regulate. Like, I don't see that as a uniquely like, I don't see that as like, oh, this is a page out of Trump at all. That's just like conservatives cutting regulation to stimulate industry. That's just what they always do.
Yeah,
Trump
and I should
pretty
also
much
point out
devastated
the
the
policy that I'm most
EPA.
opposed to is the approach that he's actually taken to homelessness in Toronto and some of the other big metropolitan areas, because a lot of people have been thrown out of their apartments and their homes because of COVID, and they've been shacking up in different parks, usually in tents, right? Which is pretty worrying when you think that it's November, and so far the weather hasn't quite broken, but it's going to soon, right? And the city has been trying to get rid of these people, and a lot of advocates for the homeless have said, well, where are they supposed to go, right? You know, they've gone to the only place they can, and there's not enough room in shelters, and it's especially difficult with COVID going on right now, since you don't want to cram people into one place. The government has absolutely no sympathy for that, at least thus far. I do agree with Victor, though. I don't think that even that is really all that different than what you'd see from a typical conservative in a Canadian mold. Which is why you should vote for them.
Yeah, there's nothing exceptionally Trumpist about Doug Ford. He's just a conservative who I disagree with. But
did Kathleen Wynne, the previous premier, put those environmental protections in place? Did she do that? So if she didn't, then that means they were around during the Harper era too, and he didn't.
Guys, we're way too in the weeds here. We have an international audience.
That's all speculation.
Fuck
by the
y'all,
way.
you get deep Canadian politics.
I'm just saying. Like
that is deep Canadian politics.
I just think like the trying to link him like just to be like to join the club of like, you know, global authoritarianism and be like, ooh, like Doug Ford is like our version. Like, no, that's feeble. Like, he's nothing like them. Well, he is just a conservative.
I see Trump deconstructing regulations, and now I see Ford deconstructing regulations. I see a similarity there because environmental regulations are a provincial prerogative in Canada. They are not a federal prerogative like they are in the States, which is why we do not have big, strong environmental groups up here.
I mean, really what we're arguing about is how to...
province.
Yeah,
really
so
if a provincial guy takes a page out of Trump's book, then boom, it's Trumpism light. And fuck you if you don't see that, because I'm right and you're wrong. And
I mean, we're just disagreeing about what to label the thing. I think we all agree that what he's doing on this thing is bad. I agree with that. It's more just a question of I don't know, marketing. How like the left wants to like brand. I don't know. Like I think there's a temptation on the left to want to like brand things as being like Trumpism or like connected to this like global like authoritarian like wave, and I just don't see that at all. I don't really see that in Canada much. It's just he's just being a shitty conservative and he's deregulating stuff.
Yeah, I'd say the same thing. Like I would never have voted for Andrew Scheer last election, right? Was he Trump North? No, he was a pretty conventional CPC leader who agitated some moderate social conservative policies and some pretty tight fiscal conservative policies.
Pills is shaking his head. He doesn't want us talking
I'm
about
shaking my head because who the fuck knows what CPC is? You think Germans know what CPC is?
Conservative Party of Canada.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Yeah, I think we can all agree that Mad Max Bernier was the real guy flirting with Trump-style politics.
100%.
And that
Sure,
got resoundingly smacked down in Canada because we are so diverse. And, well, we're like American politics, but with the extreme ends chopped off.
Okay, listen, Eric, you will not understand the satisfaction I got when the People's Party of Canada was resoundingly rejected by the people, and Bernier even lost his own riding. You know, there was a certain satisfaction that I got from that I wouldn't necessarily call erotic, but it wasn't not erotic.
I mean, there was a little chub involved in that.
I would say that my feelings of watching Trump lose and squirm is maybe borderline erotic. That feels real.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. Right? I mean, like, there was this Jim Carrey sketch where he was sitting there and he was playing Biden, and he was like, we sit there and we feel like we're above this, and the problem with this is that there has to be a winner and
Yeah, that was good.
loser. And I was like, oh, say it again.
Satisfying. Very, very satisfying. I
Deeply,
gotta tell. And maybe we should just talk about that a little bit and what's happening with, I mean, the media in general, and I mean, Trump doing exactly what people sort of feared he was doing. I mean, Bernie Sanders talked about this, that like the results would be ambiguous because of mail-in voting, and then Trump would declare victory, right? Like, I think that night, like in the middle, like probably, like I think it was like at 2 a.m. in the morning, he was like, as far as I'm concerned, we did win. And he's like, we're going to go to the Supreme Court, and it's like rigged. He says all kinds of contradictory shit. And like, I got to say today,
my favorite one is basically him saying like, all the votes for Republicans are legal, and the votes cast for Democrats where they voted for Republicans down ballot. The down ballot should count, just not the one on top of that.
I know, it doesn't make any sense. And I did see a stat today that something like 40% or no, it was 60% of people who voted for Trump think the results are illegitimate right now, which is
not surprised.
insane.
Well, did you see his Twitter today?
Yeah.
I did. He was lashing out at the Department of Justice, calling them all traitors.
And lashing out at Fox News.
He was lashing out at Fox News, which I think is a key to getting where he's going after he gets kicked out. He's setting himself up for a job at this other Newsmax or something like that.
Newsmax, and there's also One America Network or something like one. Yeah.
He's also flirted with creating what they're provisionally calling Trump TV afterwards, which I actually think would probably be one of his more successful business ventures, because if he set up Trump TV, he probably would make a lot of money off of it.
That would make money. He could pay off all his debts, his hundreds of millions of dollars in debt.
He'll probably buy one of them and then just turn it into Trump TV.
Politically, he'll be somewhere between like Rush Limbaugh and Alex Jones. I think that's like somewhere.
No, but Alex Jones is definitely smarter than Trump. Like,
and so is Rush Limbaugh.
So is Rush Limbaugh. Yeah, they peddle bullshit, but they knowingly peddle bullshit.
Well, the thing here's actually the interesting thing. I think that like makes Trump actually probably pretty weak on TV as a TV personality is because he doesn't actually have opinions. Like, I don't actually think Trump has like strong views about anything that is not connected to feeling narcissistically satisfied. So like, unless he can spin it to be like something about how like, look what I did, I don't think he has opinions about anything. Whereas like Rush Limbaugh and these other people actually have opinions that are like non-narcissistically grounded or something like that.
I think that's a really good point. Yeah. I mean, if you ever see Trump talk about policy where he's not attacking someone else, right? He's pretty boring and low energy, dare I say, right? It's like, I mean, like, you know, we're not going to allow socialism in this country. It's going to be the greatest tax plan ever.
And the answer he gives is like, it's going to be better. It's going to be the best. He's like, we're going to repeal and replace Obamacare with something much better. It's going to be beautiful. It's going to be like a beautiful. And it's like,
but just go to theme. I will say, like, one of the interesting things about this election has been how polarized the media reaction has been, because there's literally like everyone on the spectrum, right? There's like far right news sites that are basically like a coup is taking place where the Democrats are trying to take over the country. We need to rise up and stop it. To like somewhere around the squishy middle with like the established networks, MSNBC, Fox, where people are variably happy about it, but more or less willing to accept the consensus, to like far left media that are basically saying exactly what the far right media is saying. There's a coup taking place, but on the other side, right, Republicans are trying to co-opt things, and they're going to destroy the country.
It's interesting about like the way these messages get distributed through online social media. Actually, before we were taping, we were talking about Daniel Addison, this someone who we both follow on Twitter, who's kind of got these like right-wing, like anti-liberal views, and he was talking about how somebody I forget who it was that tweeted this claim that I noticed all these right-wing commentators retweeting it and being like, look at this like typical like New York Times liberal, and it was like saying something like, I think his name's Roos. His last name's Roos. I don't know if you saw this, Matt. Like he was saying, yeah, just for conservatives out there, it's possible for you to be saying factually true things, yet they are part of a misinformation campaign.
Oh,
and all these conservatives were like retweeting it, being like, but all these things are true, like totally missing the point. I don't know. At least I didn't get it. That was actually what me and Daniel Addison, I think is the name, we're talking about. Because like the things can be like, so it's true, for example, that I don't know, Bill Barr is opening an investigation into voter fraud, and then it's true that maybe like a couple of dead people voted, and it's true that like there's some debate about whether or not the law in Pennsylvania to like accept ballots that come in after the election polls close. But all those things combined, even though like when you add them all up, add up to almost nothing, and like at most, I don't know, like a few thousand ballots would be thrown out. But like all those things add up to give people a sense like there's all this voter fraud going on. So it's like factually true things that contribute. And I don't know why some conservative commentators I've been watching are seeing that observation as being like a slam dunk like example of, I don't know, like the New York Times elite who are like, I don't know, I didn't get it, and I didn't get a satisfying answer.
I think that's a really good point, right? And this is something that Trump has been really gifted at when it comes to peddling all this kind of bullshit to conservative media, because there's usually at least a tangential grain of truth in everything that he says, but he'll always couch it in such a way that it'll produce certain results and certain kinds of affect in his supporters without him ever having to be committed to epistemic consequences or any epistemic connotations to his statements. Like he'll say things, which is exactly what's going on right now with Rudy Giuliani. Like, well, people are saying that fraud is going on, or people have seen fraud going on, or people are claiming fraud is going on. And all that might be true, right? It doesn't mean anything has actually happened, but the statement that people are claiming it's true is true, right? And because you kind of create so much distance between yourself and what's factually going on in the world in a general way, you can always deny any kind of accountability for what it is that you're talking about while generating the kind of responses that you want, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think I wanted to say there's a term I learned for like a couple of weeks ago. Actually, I was listening to a podcast. This marketer talks about how like, you know, one of the tools in the tool belt of marketing, like they name different kinds of campaigns. And then there's one that they call FUD, which is fear, uncertainty, doubt, right? Mm-hmm. So like it's advertising and messaging that is meant to instill as much fear, as much uncertainty, and as much doubt as possible. And I mean, I think that this has been a perfect example of that in some ways. And I wonder, I don't know, I think that there's like there's interesting psychological mechanisms. And I wonder if we could connect it, like what kinds of theories we could connect it to, like if it fits in with like Lacanian psychoanalysis or other things. Just, you know, it does seem like there's a kind of, I don't know if I want to call it a vulnerability or a mechanism inside in the human psyche that is tempted by things that instill a sense of fear, uncertainty, doubt versus like nuance and like care and I don't know.
My turn.
Yeah, go ahead.
We are 23 minutes in. We've covered Canadian news, our opinions on Canadian news. We've covered American news. So we can keep talking about that. The interruption is just to let's move to, or at least offer a few frames for this, because I think what you just trying to move to what you just offered, fear, uncertainty, doubt. My question, like to riff off that or to advance that thesis, would be: is that the function of news specifically, a certain kind of news? And the questions that I want to get to in the next 40 minutes or so is very specifically, how does everyone having access to so much news and so many different news sources at the same time, how does that change what we thought of as something like journalistic integrity, those kinds of questions? So if you're going to provide examples, fine, but instead of just dealing back and forth, throwing examples at each other, if you can try to frame maybe the psychological effect of news, what you think the purpose is. I mean, we could go into ideology, we could go into spectacle. So I'm going to let it go where it may, but I would like to keep this a little bit to let's reflect on what the news in general does and how it functions.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that like there is a bias in the news towards sensationalism, which is, I think, connected to fear, uncertainty, doubt, FUD, because like that is for whatever reason, that's the thing that is most tempting. And you know, I think we could even connect it to ideology, like in the Althuserian sense, because like if I recall correctly, it's something like, you know, ideology for him is, you know, a representation of reality at the level of ideas that, you know, mystifies or conceals much of that reality by presenting partial truths as if they're whole truths, right? And I think that's another good way of describing what like FUD is doing. And I think in general, the media, the news, what's their incentive, right? Their incentive is to get viewers. And what are the things that are going to get viewers? It's like things that stimulate our basest human vulnerabilities, which are things that are like fear, uncertainty, doubt. And as soon as and I think like the fragmentation of media, what some people like this guy on Twitter that I was talking to, Daniel Addison, will say, you know, we call it maybe the fragmentation from our elitist leftist perspective. He calls it the democratization of media, right? That like all of a sudden now it's like everybody has access. Everyone can be a media producer. You know, before, and actually this is kind of an interesting, potentially like a historical aberration that like, I think the 20th century was a historical aberration in that there was just a couple of centralized people who controlled the main channels of media, and everybody kind of felt like, oh, NBC, you know, CBC in Canada, like all these things had some authority. But before that, actually, like I remember being reminded, I forget, a friend of mine reminded me or showed me that actually like before the 20th century, media was incredibly fragmented, not to the extent now, but like there were all kinds of like openly biased newspapers, like, you know, in the 17th, 18th, 19th century that were saying like basically propaganda for one side or the other. And I think in some ways we're maybe seeing a return to that, but it's obviously magnified by the online media landscape, which is even more obviously democratized if you want to use Addison, or fragmented if you want to use our perspective. But I don't know, maybe.
I mean,
Well, I think that's a really good point. I'm just going to push against one statement that Daniel makes, right? And that's the idea that what we're seeing right now is any kind of democracy.
Can you explain who's Daniel? Your name?
Yeah, he's just someone I was arguing with on Twitter yesterday.
Professor Addison is a kind of far-right commentator and philosopher, right? Who is, broadly speaking, a Trumpist.
Is he an academic?
Yes.
Yeah, he actually teaches like logic and philosophy at CUNY, like City University of New York.
Okay, thank you.
So he's a Gallian, right? But I mean, I've seen that conservatives are trying to make this argument, right? That there's been this democratization of the media away from these big networks that tend to push a predominantly centrist, like liberal point of view, particularly a neoliberal point of view. And I think to a certain extent it's true, right? But I think that in a deeper sense, this isn't particularly democratic, right? Because somebody who's sincerely committed to democracy wants there to be a certain equality to the kind of voices that are present in the polity. And I don't think you see that here at all, right? I think that you see some voices being given the cash and expressive potential to actually have a much bigger impact in the public sphere than others. A lot of these, you know, people come out of conservative think tanks or are funded by a tremendous amount of money. And so I don't think that this is rightly characterized as a democracy. This is closer to something like a media polyarchy, where there are diffracted media centers, some of which are much more powerful than others and have a much bigger reach than others. And what we need is actually a lot more attention paid to how it is that we can try to establish a more egalitarian playing field when it comes to which views are expressed and
what
who they're
about
targeted to.
How to, like, so yeah, democratization and fragmentation, but how does that fit in with the centralization of ownership of all of this stuff? Because yeah, okay, but media has been concentrated in the hands of a few, and even this democratization still presupposes social networking websites, which are all also very centrally owned. Like somebody owns all the channels, and it's just the content, like the information that flows through those channels. They do as little as possible to regulate that, except when people force them to. So now Twitter's flagging tweets, and Facebook's taking down... Yeah, and like Facebook's taking down all these right-wing groups and hate groups pages, which they really don't want to do that at all. But with this democratization and fragmentation comes actual more ownership of the actual communication channels themselves. So how does that, is that not kind of the opposite movement to because democratization to me would also imply the democratization of ownership. And as far as I know, nobody has a stake in this shit except for California magnates and other people like that.
I think what we're getting wrong, or the where the boundaries cross, is ownership used to mean that the person who owns the newspaper, broadcast media, television station, whatever, there would be pressure from the top that would decide what that newspaper or television station was able to publish and what they would publish. So I think it's an asymmetry to compare social media to that, because the owners of social media, presumably, if they're disinterested and purely capitalist, are happy no matter what is being posted, as long as more people are reacting, because if people are reacting, they're going to come back. If people are coming back, then they're seeing more ads. So in the case of ownership, I think there's an asymmetry between broadcast media and what we could call new media and platform ownership versus mass media ownership.
Yeah, I agree with that. I also think I was going to say we should make a distinction maybe between economic democratization and like democratization of expression or something like that. And like, look, I'm not even the one who wants to push to say it's become a democratization, but if I were to make the argument, I guess I would say like there's been a democratization of expression, but obviously not a democratization of economic ownership of those channels.
And I would say that the expression part is meaningless. I mean, if we're going to drop McLuhan in here, then the medium is the message. It doesn't matter what the content is. You can democratize what people can say all you want. Doesn't matter one bit.
I mean, I don't
it's
really
the
agree
ownership that matters. Look at Zoom. Zoom came in and took a huge chunk of the video chatting market share. And the other month, when they were going to have a symposium on Palestine at the University of New York, Zoom came in and shut that down and said, "This is political. This
Really?
goes
Wow.
against our terms of use.
I hadn't heard
and
that.
you can't do it."
I hadn't heard that.
Yeah,
That's fucked
yeah.
up,
Look
if
it
that's
up.
true.
It's a
I'm
news
surprised.
thing.
I'm
Well, that's what
surprised.
they do, right? It's not that they don't police what you can say. They police what you can't say. Like there's certain things that you just can't go on. Like Israel, Palestine. No, Zoom's not going to have that. Like Facebook and Twitter are the same. They don't really care what you say as long as it's within a certain range, I guess. I mean, like, this is the point, like, Benjamin makes at the end of the article, too. Like, until real property relations change, that's when the meaningful change happens. Because the war machine will mobilize everybody and leave property ownership intact.
Well, I was about to say,
I'm going to
like,
impose
can you
a
say more
rule.
about
Matt,
what-
you're next to talk. I'm going to impose a rule. Cut this out. We're going to go around clockwise because we're talking over each other, like, constantly. So... starting with
Our screens might be arranged differently. I'm in the top right in my, my screen.
Oh yeah, same. I'm on the.
Really?
Yeah, boomer. You didn't
I'm
think
in
of
the
that,
top,
did you?
I'm in the top right also.
Okay, why don't we go in alphabetical order then, starting with Matt.
Okay. Yeah, no, I agree with a lot of what's been said here, right? I think, to riff off of Victor's points, the problem that I have is that what you see here is a formal democratization in the sense that everyone's able to participate, but not an equality or a democracy of expressive potential, if I want to call it that, right? And that's because there are some people whose voices are amplified well beyond others, and that's a serious problem when you're talking about the capacity to actually spread misinformation or hyper-real bullshit in today's world. And one example that I can give you is take a magazine like American Greatness, which is a far-right magazine in the United States that's escalated in popularity exponentially since Trump was elected into office. It's owned by private businessmen who funded it to the tune of several $1 million, and it's able to produce very high quality, very slick productions, right, that propagate a far-right message. You compare that with something like Jacobin, right, which relies on user donations and typically far more small-scale contributions, right? It's harder for them to have the same capacity for expressive potential that an outlet like American Greatness has, even though they've been around for quite a bit longer and arguably speak to just as significant a segment of the population, right? And I think that you're seeing this become worse and worse in some ways, at least in the United States, as a result of numerous court decisions like Citizens United, and it's a big problem. And I'm not sure what the solution to that is, in part because every time you try to think of a way to grapple with this difficulty, the situation changes because new media emerge, and you kind of have to rethink your entire program, right?
I pass because I don't have a response to that.
Okay. Yeah, I want to say, like, I think it's interesting to like how we define making a difference. Eric was talking about like it makes no difference, but also like how we define democratization. I guess like I think the stories a bit more complicated than just saying, oh, like it makes sense since there's the same owners or centralized ownership, it makes no difference. Like, I mean, I guess it depends on what you mean by difference. I mean, it seems to me that it's made a huge difference I think Donald Trump's election was made possible by like, even in our own personal lives here right now, like we're making this podcast, we have like, thousands of listeners or downloads. And like, I think that that's only possible as a consequence of what some call the democratization of media. So, I mean, I don't know. I feel like it's, the difference, we need to define what that difference is. And I guess maybe I would ask Eric, like, when you say like, it makes no difference. I mean, I guess it makes no difference if your goal like is to democratize economic ownership, then yeah, sure, it doesn't make a difference for that, but it seems to make quite a large social difference and political difference in some ways.
I mean,
I'm just going to make a very important point here and say that our thousands of viewers are all attributed to the fact that Eric's sultry voice just rings out through the podcast every time I listen to it, and it's irresistible. So really, almost all of our success should be attributed to him.
It's because you can hear my uvula vibrating. I actually had a specific quote in mind because I promised I was going to drop some theory into this, and I had this quote I had in mind comes from Benjamin near the end of his work of art essay, very famous essay he wrote, and the quote goes, so let's say the forces of fascism have been on the rise in the States since Trump has been elected, and maybe now they'll peter out, but let's say. Here's the quote: "Fascism attempts to organize the newly proletarianized masses while leaving intact the property relations which they, the masses, strive to abolish. It sees its salvation in granting expression to the masses, but on no account granting them rights. The masses have a right to change property relations. Fascism seeks to give them expression in keeping these relations unchanged. The logical outcome of fascism is an aestheticizing of political life." And that's the content. The content is left up to the users, whatever. But the property relations are all moving towards fascism. They're all moving towards centralization and centralized ownership. Yeah. And that was the point that I had in mind, is Benjamin's idea that you could mobilize your entire populace in a war, and then they all come back after the war, and property relations remain exactly where they are, no matter how victorious you are.
Yeah, and I should actually also add, like, one of the most remarkable passages of that same essay is, and I think it's really prescient when you think about the Trump era, and it's that the reason fascism is appealing in the 20th century is because fascism is a society deciding to entertain itself in the most magnificent possible way. Because he says, think about fascism. It's very entertaining, right? There's always an enemy, a heroic story.
Yeah, it's the spectacle.
Violence, that's at the center of everything. It's extremely entertaining. And that's one of the reasons why it's so dangerous, because it's really hard to dissociate yourself from, as Eric said, the spectacle, right?
Yeah, it's the aestheticizing means you're making it into a spectacle. It's the immediate, you're aestheticizing politics so people can say and do whatever they like. Like, he's writing this in the 1930s, which is, again, like the rise of fascism in Europe and Germany specifically. And I guess he was in France. He had to flee to France by the time he was writing this, maybe. Mm-hmm. But I mean, it's very prescient, and it has a lot to do with today's situation. The masses can express themselves in any way they want, but they have no right to ownership. And that's the problem.
I got a good segue here, since P is after M, and I'm going to drop some Marshall McLuhan. Here's the quote: "Specialist technologies detribalize, and non-specialist electric technology retribalizes." So in the same way, you have like the microphone from a media studies perspective. If you take a McLuhan very seriously, the microphone was responsible for Nazism, because you can tribalize on such a broad scale, and people don't have like the psychological resistances yet built in to be able to like place a media within history. So they become dehistoricized and then can get swept up into something like Nazism. And there's problems with McLuhan, and this isn't like a proper thesis that I'm going to sit here and defend, but it brings back this idea of tribalism that when McLuhan says that specialists technologies detribalize. He's talking very specifically about writing and advanced writing and, like, I guess you could say academic or historical writing. Whereas as soon as you have a mass media, then you can also mobilize a mass using that media. So it plays into this fascism, it plays into this tribalism, and I'm ceding my time, but if I could finish, then my question is, how does this, the social media re-tribalize? And I have a thesis for that, but I'm going to pass it on to
I mean, it's a fascinating question, right? I mean, if you think that people weren't psychologically prepared for the microphone and it brought all these calamitous results.
Oh, I should have said radio. Sorry. I meant like radio broadcast.
Sure. No, but I mean, God only knows how people would possibly be prepared for like the barrage of digital technologies that have been invented over the last 20 years, right? I mean, your brain would just not be prepared for that in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing the impact in many different ways. I mean, I know, you know, it's a different effect than like the media topic, but I know that like people are talking about how like young girls are now like, you know, much more likely to cut themselves because I guess like the bullying online, like, so there's something, I mean, I'm just saying there is obviously like a big impact that we're not psychologically ready. And, you know, there's something about the medium that I think does invite exactly the tribalization. Yeah, I don't know. I'll pass it on to someone else.
One of the things that I like about McLuhan that I do actually think he was prescient in observing, and this is something that Neil Postman pointed out also in his book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, is that once upon a time, you know, print culture, as he calls it, and I think this is kind of too generic a term, was ascendant, right? And the basic idea, putting it really simply in his book, is that, or in his books, was that in our Gutenbergian universe, the way that people primarily digested information was through print mediums. Typically books, sometimes long-form newspaper articles. And these all had their problems, and they produced certain kinds of subjectivities, but they did have the benefit of encouraging people to deal with complexity in a reasonably sophisticated way. Because if you're going to read a book on a topic, you're probably going to have to deal with it in a certain in-depth sense, since 200 pages is a long discussion of a topic by any means, especially today, right? Whereas now, with this movement towards a new acoustic culture, as he puts it, where everything tends to be short, dynamic, and to the point, people retreat from that kind of complexity into antagonisms that simplify the world and that have kind of virile quality to them. And part of this is, you know, due to the ascendance of acoustic culture, but it's also because print media, books, long-form articles, and all that kind of stuff, has declined precipitously. And one of the things that Postman points out in his book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, and, you know, this is quite fascinating to me, is that during the abolitionist period, Abraham Lincoln and various pro-slavery delegates would sit there and have a debate in front of people for up to 5 or 6 hours at a time. Like a 5 or 6 hour debate about slavery, you know, which it warrants, right, if you think about it and all the complexities involved, right? And Postman says, and this is in the 1980s, who the hell would sit down for a 5 hour debate now? You know what I mean? Within an hour, we get bored because we're used to watching CNN or Fox or whatever it happens to be, where these debates are boiled down to, at that point, 20 minutes, right? And I think that's even truer now than it was before, right? We expect things to be distilled into 7-minute YouTube videos. And if it's any longer, we think, well, people are going to get bored. So we've got to find a way to take this complicated issue and boil it down to 7 minutes, which means you're going to be very tempted to give a simplistic narrative.
Sound bites.
I mean, that's true. That's true to some extent, but I guess, you know, to push against it slightly, like I think we are seeing, you know, with what some call the new democratization of media, that there is actually an appetite for long form stuff. And like, you know, I'm not like, I obviously like agree. I do sometimes think that there's a tendency in theory, or like theoretical analysis, to get carried away with like the narrative of how much worse everything's getting. And like, I agree, like there's obviously a lot of, but like that temptation, it can blind us from just like obviously acknowledging like, yeah, there are some things that are better than they were a little while ago. And like one thing is that this media does show that there is an appetite for actually incredibly long form content. I mean, some of these podcasts, you know, 2-3 hour long, I mean, discussions, just talking about stuff and people listen. I mean, Joe Rogan, you know, he's not the highest common denominator at all, but he does sometimes record podcasts with like, I don't know, like interesting people for 3+ hours,
Penrose.
and people listen.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I mean, yes, the media. It's kind of interesting just how like this new media does kind of, it creates pathways to go both ways. Mostly the way that I think we could complain about and say is bad and worse, but got to also acknowledge the good.
Yeah, not just that. I mean, you think about like people like us, right? Like, I mean, if you want to learn about a major philosopher now, once upon a time you'd have to actually go to a bookstore, buy their books, read them, spend several hours a day doing it. Now anyone can put it pick up their phone, put in their headphones, and listen to some professor give a lecture on Socrates or whatever it happens to be. That's kind of an accomplishment in some respects, right?
I agree. It is kind of funny, not that I'm really not a big fan of, oh God, who's that evolutionary psychologist who's like Canadian? He wrote that book recently about how everything's getting better.
Oh, Steven Pinker?
Steven Pinker. Yeah, I'm not a fan of Steven Pinker at all. But I did find it amusing, like how angry people got, like, on the left, like just the suggestion that things are getting better. Like there is a real resistance to that, which I do find kind of amusing, even though like I said, I'm not a fan of Pinker really at all. But
Well, I think of democratization as well in terms of it's a new kind of participation. So we're seeing more people participating in the mass media, and we're seeing a close in the information gap.
yes,
So people who did not have access to any information before now have access to a whole world of information. And I think the main problem with that is that there's a sort of learning curve to this. There's an element where we need to master this new reality by incorporating it into we have to form new habits around it. And
Yes.
right now we have very bad habits because all of this is happening so quickly. We've barely had a single generation to even adapt to this new media reality where everybody has access, everybody has a voice. And one of the consequences that I'm seeing is that standards of evidence are going out the window. People are more interested in the narrative itself rather than the evidence for that narrative. Evidence has dropped. Like suddenly YouTube is evidence, TikTok is evidence. And nobody's critically analyzing the narrative in the sense that, well, what's the evidence that's been, like, we can see Trump just saying whatever, like they're stealing the election, there's voting fraud, and he's not presenting any evidence because he doesn't freaking have to.
Says there's
because all you do is you opinion shop, and then you pick the opinion that most conforms to your worldview you've already formulated, and then you just run with it. And fuck it if anybody thinks differently, because it's your right, it's your God-given right to hold the views that you do, and nobody can change your mind, right? So there's a certain element, what I'm saying, of habituation. Like even Benjamin pointed this out in his essay. Like we need to master these new media through habit, not through just they're not just they're not just an addition. There's something new we have to get used to.
This is exactly what McLuhan says, because he calls media the extension of man. But what he's talking about is each of them are extensions of your body. So being able to listen to us on your headphones is just an extension.
New perceptual apparatus.
Yeah, it's an extension of your ear. But the other thing that he says, like I referenced the Hitler radio example before, but when you need to form a new equilibrium every time a new media technology disrupts the environment. And I think a lot of what we're seeing, especially with the age gap, right? Like the whole QAnon thing, this kind of makes sense of it to me, is that if you grow up in an environment where you see, for whatever reason, the news apparatus as being reliable, then when you see something on Facebook, I think you're less, not even likely, but less able to doubt the validity of what you're seeing that's beamed through your eyes. Because in the same way that this podcast is an extension of your ears, the screen is an extension of your eyeballs, in that you can see something that's telepresent. You can see something that's very far away. So one thing that, like just what you're saying, Eric, is that we might have a psychical / embodied apparatus that's actually incapable of dealing with this much information at the same time. And I think I don't know if I would defend this thesis, but I think it does fall on like age boundaries, whether or not you can trust something that you see, or whether or not you would trust something that you see.
Can I just ask a question riffing on this? Because this always struck me as McLuhan's most radical and honestly, I think, most unbelievable thesis. And I mean, unbelievable in the pejorative sense, right? Where he said, like, media are extension of our senses, right? You know, the telescope is the extension of our eye. You know, the microphone is the extension of our ear and so on. Or, you know, headphones are the extension of our ear and so on and so forth. One of the things that he points out, which I think is actually kind of interesting, is that there's always been this presupposition in the Western tradition of a natural human being, right? In the same sense that there's a natural monkey or a natural deer and so on. But one of the things that McLuhan points out, in his mind at least, is that other animals have media as well. You know, slugs have shells.
Do they?
Ants. Yeah, no, they have shells.
Slugs
right?
do?
Slugs do, yeah. Or snails?
And then, crabs,
You guys, when's the last time you've been outside?
A while
Slugs
ago.
don't have shells.
They do,
Snails.
right?
Snails.
Oh, snails. Sorry, yeah, snails have shells. Okay, my bad. Yeah, so he says snails have shells, and then, you know, monkeys use these rackets. And he says that, like, thinking of us without media would be as unusual and abstract as thinking of snails without their shells, right? Or thinking about turtles without their shells. And I always found this very provocative and interesting, but because he's trying to denaturalize the idea that there's some kind of fundamental human being without our media. But I'm not really sure how far you can stretch this metaphor.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to also riff on something Eric said before about, like, you know, we need to develop new habits. And I think it kind of speaks to what Pills was saying as well. And I guess this is where I kind of become maybe a bit of like an or like less utopian and pessimistic. You know, it's like, I don't really think that there's ever going to be a time when like a not insignificant, if not quite significant percentage of the population is always going to be incredibly vulnerable to things like FUD, right? Fear, uncertainty, doubt. Like I don't think we're going to reach some time when citizens and human beings are like better trained and can take in information critically. Like, not gonna fucking happen. Like, there's always gonna be people who are, because it's easier to just to be tempted by the simplified story than it is to like actually understand what nuance and critical thinking is.
Yeah, do you know how offended I was the other day when I saw a QAnon supporter of all things saying, you know, people need to think for themselves and question everything. And I'm like, oh my God, if Socrates was here and he heard you saying that, I'm like, you aren't thinking of yourself and criticizing everything. You're willing to believe absolutely anything as long as it coincides with your worldview, right?
Exactly.
You know, just being willing to believe nonsense doesn't suddenly make you a Socratic figure.
I can reference my academic days in saying that exposure to something on the internet is far disproportionately effective to old people than it is to young people.
Oh yeah, I see my older family members posting shit all the time. That just
sharing those chain emails. Oh God.
Oh
no
yeah,
critical reading whatsoever. Just like, oh, I saw it. It must be real.
I'm scared of how much money my Omas donated to the Nigerian prince in exile.
It's funny,
Telegram
actually.
Trick.
Literally just today, my one of my favorite undergrad professors, who I'm friends with, she called me because she got some message. She clicked on the wrong thing and she got a message on her computer that was like, your computer's locked. You have to call Microsoft and like unlock your computer. And she was like very unsure and scared. And I was like, okay, just like close the browser. And then
you're her first call, Victor?
Well, no, we're good friends.
I
We're
see,
good friends. Yeah, like she was actually friends with my dad.
I like this example that Benjamin gives in the article. Like, you can contrast the new media with architecture. Like, you think of architecture as also media, right? It's an extension of ourselves in a certain way. And when we go to work, for example, we don't really pay much attention. We receive the architecture of our workplace and our home and our local environment in a state of distraction. Whereas things that are new, like if you encounter a brand new building or new media, I mean, you encounter those in a state of like concentrated awe in a certain way, right? You're paying attention to them. When you're walking through your building, right, you know which doors not to open, you know not to fall down a staircase that's an emergency exit. Like, you just have all of these sorts of habitual ways of treating the building, and you know not to walk into a janitor's closet or something like that. Whereas the equivalent of walking into a janitor's closet in new media is like accidentally dropping into like a 4chan QAnon discussion or something like that. And then you don't know what to do with that. You're in the janitor's closet now, and you're like, oh, I guess this is an important place because people are discussing it. Oh my God. I think that's kind of goes along with the old people believing these chain letters and shit too.
I want to say, though, I am really tempted to give like a classically Freudian reading of your interpretation and just say that, like, anytime I see a giant building, I'm going to now sit there and think to myself, like, that guy has to have just a monstrously big penis. Like, just unbelievably huge.
Or really small, maybe.
Or both, yeah. That. You know, it's like, one way or another, this building is definitive when it comes to interpreting his fellows.
Actually, could I connect some Merleau-Ponty to what Eric just said? You know,
Please.
I think about what you're saying there, and it reminds me of, like, you know, the way in our embodied habituation and like our kind of like, you know, our actual situation as embodied creatures, we walk around, and you're right, like you know, like things don't solicit you, right? Like things that you don't go into. I mean, that's one of Merleau-Ponty's like key terms, right? It's like your body is like habituated and changed in a way that is like reciprocally engages with the world, where the world will solicit you based on how like your body's been habituated, right? And I think like that's the difference with new media, that like new media is always trying to solicit you, right? Like it's always pulling you in these different directions. And I think Pills, you might be right that when you're older, like you're really vulnerable to those solicitations. Whereas like us, you know, we grew up basically with the internet. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when it was like new and kind of like edgy, but like imagine the generation younger than us, like they really like they're totally like grew up with it always existing and always being like a social media. Like my students, probably undergrads, like first years, probably always had social media in their life in some form.
Shout out to anyone who remembers waiting on a browser for a JPEG to download, and it would be like,
slowly.
What kind of JPEG were you waiting for? What kind of JPEG?
Oh, why don't you mind your own fucking business?
I remember seeing this really chilling video in 2015. There was a child, and she saw an actual physical magazine, and she went out and she tried to touch it, and she was really confused when it didn't actually like just immediately go to another screen. But she couldn't understand the concept of like a paper media.
Have you guys heard this anecdote of I don't know if it's true or not, but the kid who sees a floppy disk and goes, "Why did somebody 3D print the save icon?"
That's amazing.
Anyway, I can't fucking wait until we get to Merleau-Ponty, because I think we could stay in Merleau-Ponty for a long time.
Yeah, it's useful, I think. Yeah.
I think what's really interesting in the news, or to see news as a mirror world, because the news does represent things that actually happen in the world, but it's so highly selective so as to make the entire world seem extremely scandalous, like something's always happening, like you have to respond, like your politics matter, for example, and it's demanding a response all the time. Whereas if you had no access to the news, the world's very boring. Like, even despite elections, despite who's in power, despite like the broad circumstances of the world's a very boring place, and things happen very slowly. Almost nothing changes. But if you look at the news and you don't have like a filter to see, okay, this is what is trying to be groped out of my body from a Merleau-Pontian sense, they're trying to elicit a response. It creates almost a condition. Like, if the world were actually like the news, you would be insane to not have anxiety disorder.
It would be like a war. It would be like war.
Yeah.
It would feel like bullets were flying like all around you. You would feel like you're in Nam or something. Like it's funny. My dad, like I was talking to him the other day, and he was like, you know, he doesn't leave his apartment because he's older and he's taking medication, which like makes his immune system a little bit more vulnerable. So like he really is being really careful with COVID stuff. And you know, he sees the news and he's just watching cable news all day, and he'll just be like, oh, like what's it like in Toronto right now, like the numbers, and I'm just like, I don't know, like I'm just going about my business. But like it does create like this perception, if all you're doing is watching the news, that there's like, that the world is becoming this chaotic thing, but it's true. Like, I mean, I think it's worth noticing how like there isn't really much of a correspondence between like what you hear in the news and just your everyday, you know, goings on walking around. And it's like, I just walk around and I wear a mask when I go into stores, and like, I don't know, I can't see that numbers are higher when I'm out there in the city. Like I can't, it doesn't feel like that, you know, it's just, it only feels like that when you're watching the news.
This is the thesis of the spectacle, by the way. Like
Yeah, exactly.
the real world would look much more like sitting and looking at your backyard for an entire day. I mean, I don't have a backyard and I probably never will. But if I did, that would be what the world looks like. Slow changes. Every once in a while, there's a bird that flies by, and that's it.
Yeah, I'll just say, like, when I was living in Mexico, partly because of the media environment that exists here in Canada and the United States, right? Like, people would sometimes ask me, like, are you safe? What's going on? What's happening? I'm like, it's just a place like anywhere else. You know what I mean? Like, literally, my day consisted of walking to the store, talking to somebody in Spanish, being like, un cigarette, por favor, and him being, sí, señor, buying a cigarette, going back, smoking it, and feeling bad. Like, it's very, very generic.
You can buy individual
But if you see,
cigarettes
like,
in
the
Mexico?
You can, yeah. It's basically the equivalent of 3 cents for a cigarette. Right?
Well, that's cheap.
It is, yeah. Dangerously cheap. But, you know, the thing is, like, if you kind of get the hyper-real depiction of this entire society that you see presented in Canadian or American media, it's very different, right? Like, it's drugs and sex and violence constantly. Not like that at all. It's really quite a boring place, as you would put it.
No,
in
it's
the good sense, right?
It's
You know,
full
where
of
people are
it's
just living
full
their
of
lives trying to do their
socialists
thing.
trying to steal ballots and burn ballots and create and like show up with new ballots. That's actually, it's funny because I think that if anyone listens to This American Life, the recent episode, I think it was called like Squeaker. They followed around like a militia group, a white militia group, to like go to polling stations to basically just like make sure that there wasn't any funny business happening. And I think like when you listen to the story, it's describing exactly this, right? Because they got all worked up. They're like, oh, there's going to be people, Democrats trying to steal the election. And they go to the polls and they just like meet really nice people and they just like have a nice time and have like friendly conversations with people and like nothing's happening. It's like, you know. But
Yeah,
they're expecting to like run in and have to, and like they were scared that literally like BLM, like Black Lives Matter people were going to be like intimidating voters to like vote for Democrats or something. And like, obviously.
Yeah, you know, like Captain Woke and like the giant army of BLM supporters is just going to be like,
it's going to be
putting
socialist
a wall up and
BLM.
be
Yeah.
like, you know, we can't allow anybody who looks even vaguely white to come in here and cast a ballot.
And literally it was just like mostly pretty lovely interactions. There's even a really nice one with like, where he starts talking to this Democratic woman and they just have a very, very like friendly, constructive conversation and it's like nothing's going on. Yeah.
I'd like to redux and say, okay, so from another point of view, our news media that we've known for the past, in the 20th century, built on radio and then television, and before that, newspapers and print media. Like today, those institutions, I would say, are failing. They are failing in that they're fading away and being absorbed into other businesses, and they're failing in the sense that they're failing people too. They're not giving proper information, and also the whole election is another institution. It's a political institution that's also failing. It is not able to absorb all of the emotion of the country in a certain way. So both the news media and politics, the specific institution of elections, are both failing, and they need to be radically reorganized. I just read an article the other day about Canadian news and how most people don't realize how on the brink of collapse Canadian media is. Like, they are so far gone right now that they have, I mean, we probably all know that in the past 10 or 15 years, so many journalists have gone independent, been cut out of, there's big, huge news, what do they call them, news dead zones or something? Places where there's just no local news reporting
local
at
news
all.
is really the big problem, especially.
Like, it's all failing us. And I know from watching shows like Last Week Tonight that local news reporting does amazing work. They are amazing people and they do great in-depth journalism, and those things are disappearing because they're being absorbed again. Ownership is changing and they're being absorbed into larger conglomerates, and they're all changing their focus, and they're becoming kind of homogenous. So it's kind of strange at the same time. Yeah, all the media is centralizing like this, but they also don't mind letting this sort of chaos of everybody's opinions going on, because it kind of distracts everybody from that background, like what's really happening in these spheres that matter. Everybody's too focused on the narratives and what people believe and why they believe it. Everyone's too distracted by all that shit, which is just a smokescreen for what's really going on. Is centralization, standards are failing, people aren't getting the information they need to go out and vote. They're just being fed all this like tendentious bullshit that has nothing to do with fucking reality whatsoever, and none of it's backed up by evidence. So to me, this is a sign that these institutions need to be, we can't just let the free market sort this shit out, because it's not going to do it. Free market is just like evolution in a cultural sense. It's not going to work. We need to go in and make a concerted effort to reorganize these institutions and make them work again. And they're not going to work in the same way they worked before. We need to figure something else out. We need to make them more efficient. We need to cut away the administrative and bureaucratic bullshit that's going on, and we need to truly democratize them and decentralize them, and not just democratize them in the sense that you can just say whatever you want, because nobody gives a shit about that. Your voice is immediately drowned out by the million other voices on there, and the narratives that emerge, like the QAnon, like the whatever other conspiracy theories, like voter fraud, and all these narratives that emerge, they don't really matter in the end, to me, in the long run. Because what's happening is a huge transformation. The internet was just come online in the 1990s. That's like less than 30 years ago. So something needs to change, right? Like, we can't just use economic interventions to shore up the old institutions. We don't need bailouts. We don't need to dump money into these failing institutions. We need to just get rid of them and change them. We need to shift the emphasis back onto local reporting, back onto higher standards, back onto integrity.
There's a lot of deontology in that statement that I don't usually hear from you, Eric.
Yeah, I know. I'm taking a little risk by saying, like, by being a little prescriptive here, but I think compared to what is happening, like, if nobody steps up and say, like, this is something we need to do, this is something we need to demand from our political and cultural institutions, rather than just letting them sort themselves out and we get boots on the ground and we battle these narratives one by one like we're playing fucking whack-a-mole with psycho right-wingers, it's never going to make a big difference.
I mean, I like the imperative tense, but it's new to me hearing from you.
It also sounds a little vague, but like I agree with the sentiment. Like, I mean, I mean, but like, I don't know. What do you suggest? Like, I mean, I guess to some extent we're like lucky in Canada that we have like a public broadcaster that's significant. That it's like, I don't know. Like, how do you like? They I think CBC has local news in most cities of any sort of significance.
Yeah. But, by the way, if you're American and you haven't heard of state-owned media, we have some, and it's not great. It's lib. It's called the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, but it's better. It's better than our alternatives here on most issues most of the time. So, redistribution, socialist broadcasting is a good place to start.
Well, should we nationalize Twitter?
Well, being less vague about news organizations, I would say they need to be public funded, so they have freedom rather than having to seek private funding. They should be public funded, and then they should also be strictly separated from like politics directly, in the same way that like legislative and executive are separate branches, and they can't. The news needs to also be publicly funded, but also untouchable by whoever happens to be in power.
Right. Maybe a good example of that would be like the model of Elections Canada. Elections Canada is like is an arm's length organization that's publicly funded, and they run all of our elections in Canada, right? And they and they draw the districts.
Yeah.
And,
whereas America leaves it to state by state.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, Elections Canada is a great example.
Don't paint too rosy a picture, or we're gonna get a bunch of immigrants from the South.
We got some
It's just
space
like-
out west for you.
I don't
It's not even
want
that great,
immigrants.
it's just-
What I want is annexation. I've been telling people that. It's like if New York State to Maine, and then like Washington State to like California, we're just fucking tired. We want to join Canada. I'd be like 100%. Let's do it.
Well, let's
I
take
wanna have a
Washington, Oregon, and California if we're gonna do that.
yeah, but I also
Yeah.
want New York.
Yeah,
I mean,
we'll just
like, what's the
just
fucking
take the
point in
big
annexing
productive
chunks of-
centers. We'll have a giant U-shaped country, an upside down U.
Exactly, and like we can like carve out like a hole to get Chicago also, and just like incorporate that.
And then the whole Midwest, we'll just cut them off.
Yeah, something like
Right.
that. You know, that's
I
what
All
I'm
right,
remember-
but this
I
is the
remember,
plan.
like,
This is our long-term goal here, to enact, first of all, Eric's vision of state-owned media, but then also to annex the richest states in the U.S. for Canada, of course.
Well, I
the
remember,
coolest cities.
humorist Fran Lebowitz. I remember she's asked sometimes at her talks, like what do you think about the Trump phenomenon? Like, what should we do differently to like help us to like solve polarization? And she was like, you know what? There was a civil war here, and I think we made a big mistake. Should have just let them leave.
Let them separate.
Let them leave.
Let me be clear. I don't know if state-owned media is the same as like a nationalized industry where everybody sort of has a stake in it. I think that's maybe the way to go.
Oh, like a
is
co-op or something. Or
well, I don't know. Like Iran, for example, they have a nationalized like oil industry there, and it's kind of like the bane of OPEC a lot of the time. And it's
Right,
because
right.
people have. I mean, I'm gonna put my foot deep inside of my mouth if I say this, but it's almost like everyone has a stake in the industry. So something that's publicly funded that people also have a stake in, rather than just strictly state-owned in like some kind of Bolshevik model, and not corporate-owned like the American model, somewhere in the middle.
But do we
where
allow
people-
corporate-owned media to continue to exist in this?
I mean, public-private partnerships, like I've ragged on them a lot, and they're shit just on their own. But like you could throw in a little bit of that, maybe. I mean, obviously, advertising is big money, and you can't just ignore it. Like Facebook and Google snaps up all the advertising dollars in Canada now, because when these companies came out like Craigslist and other kinds of listing websites, immediately the classified section revenue dried up. So you need that sort of advertising space. But right now, all the advertising space is going to Google and Facebook and other big media conglomerates like that. And our local news organizations and our state-owned news organizations are getting none of it.
Yeah, have you guys also like on the topic of centralized corporate control of things? I've noticed conservatives complaining a lot about Twitter and censoring
what the
stuff.
hell, right?
And so what's interesting, I don't know,
Complaining
did you guys
on Twitter about Twitter?
Yeah, did you guys hear how they actually how the number one app right now is something called Parler, which is like the conservative alternative to Twitter, and it had like 3 million downloads like last week after Trump was getting censored.
That's like scary, but also I would enjoy it at the same time, because you wouldn't have to see their
part of
stuff.
me is like,
but
yeah.
then no, you're going to get the beer hall pooch coming out of some group on there.
Yeah, I was kind of like, yeah, like good, go over to Parler. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say the beer hall putsch didn't actually end very well for those people. So, you know what? Go ahead and try.
Well, that was the first time they were censored, and then
10
years
I
later,
got to commend them, because at least they're actually trying to use the free market to find an alternative.
Yeah, and I will say this with Eric, I think one of the bigger problems that we see right now is underestimation of the importance of municipal relations and municipal government, along with local reporting. Because if you actually think about it, how your municipality responds to things is in many ways a lot more consequential for people's lives than what the federal government does, either in the United States or Canada. And yet you very rarely ever hear about it, right? I mean, I know that John Tory is the mayor of this city. I could not tell you who my councilman is at all. I don't even know what my district is.
I do know that my transit works, though. If it didn't work, then I would probably have to go vote in a municipal election. But
yeah, like we need to re-incentivize that kind of local reporting and that kind of independent journalism that we're just not incentivizing it, and it's going away now. I mean, we're going to have a hell of a time getting it back especially the longer we wait.
Well, and it's
more-
interesting because the American experiment was originally supposed to be very like localized. It was supposed to have a very local emphasis. That was like the whole point. But then as soon as you got mass media, I think there is a phenomenon that actually I think political scientists talk about where like local politics became nationalized in the US, where like all of a sudden you were voting for like your local congressman based on, whereas like before, like, and which was for the majority of the United States' existence, like local politics and who your local member was, you'd often split your vote and you'd vote maybe like for a Democrat locally, but a Republican nationally. And that was much more common just because people were much more connected to what was happening and what their local interests were and state interests versus their federal interests. And that certainly, I think, media, the growth of new media and just like, 20th century media did see a steep decline in what was, like I said, America was originally supposed to be a bunch of local, like a bunch of states, like very localized, but that's kind of totally gone away.
Yeah, and the fact that you can even point to a silent majority is kind of an indication that there's not enough local channels for people to learn and people to express their opinions about things, or at least people to channel their energy.
While we wrap up here, I just want to recall one more quotation or concept quotation from the Sage of Toronto, Marshall McLuhan, who said that...
Oh, I thought you were going to say Jordan Peterson.
I thought you were going to say Doug Ford.
No. Okay, the Sage of Toronto is a proper term designated for Marshall McLuhan. Okay. Even De Boer called him that. But he said the secondary orality that we're entering through telepresence or presence over, the internet now, will bring us into a new global village. And he saw this as kind of a good thing. But De Boer's criticism of this, and this is excellent, De Boer said, what McLuhan never understood is that we're going to bring back a global village, but what happens in a village? It's gossip, backbiting, rumors spread very quickly, and all of these negative aspects to being in a village that McLuhan never brought up because he was so hyped on this idea of an oral connection between people. So with that, I think we're ready to...
What an excellent quote. I couldn't agree more. Yeah. I mean, I hate village life. I mean, it's the worst.
So with that, this was a little bit of a different episode. How do you guys think it went
I thought that was pretty good. I don't know.
It was fun, yeah. I mean, like, it's nice not to have to talk about things like an academic every now and then.
But I feel like we were pretty good about bringing up some academic concepts here and there. Like, I don't know. I feel like this was good.
I was able to refer to like Freudian theories of buildings as penises, so I'm very content.
Well, I know that's what makes you happy.
Felt like I was at the bar. It's like a conversation we'd have at the bar. I ate some pasta and drank some beer. And
all right, if we have
I feel like there was some
3
flow.
categories of episodes on this, channel, podcast, we have the interviews, then we have the deep dives, and these are going to be the topical episodes, which I think all of us tend to enjoy more because we're not trying to flex or do research, which nobody likes to do.
Shooting the shit. I like research. Fuck all y'all.
No, this was fun. I think, and hopefully it'll come out sounding pretty good. We'll see.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to cut up some of the name dropping about terms that our international audience, and thank you, international audience, but they're not gonna understand what they are. So, that all said, thanks you guys a lot for showing up. I have an appointment to meet, even in this hour of night.
What's the appointment?
We're still recording.
Family.
It's family.
Family
oriented. But still telepresent.
Okay. Should we stop recording?
I'm forming the global village.
Okay.
All right, guys. Thanks. We'll see you later.
Thanks, everybody. Yeah.
All right.